One thing we need to think a lot about as instructors of students, both in higher education and elsewhere, is how we're going to help our students transfer information from one context, like the classroom, to another, like the real world. And that can be a pretty challenging thing to do because though we take it for granted that this happens all the time in schools, it's pretty rare that students are actually able to independently take information that they've learned and then apply it somewhere else. Generally, this means that we need to make learning and doing the same thing. That follows kind of what we call a one-to-one principle that follows with our learning objectives, matching our activities or our instruction. So as a teacher or as an instructor in a course, what I'd like my students to do as a skill or a goal is what I call the learning objective. That is, the thing that they'll be able to take away from the class and be able to apply in the real world, the desired result, the thing that matters most about that course. There are two really important pieces that define what a learning objective is or how it should be written. The first is that it needs to be something that's actionable. That is, it is something to be done, something that a student could actually do or create or show me that they are able to do, not just necessarily spit it back out on a test, but be able to take that information and then produce something with it. The second thing is that we as instructors need to be able to measure and evaluate that thing. So when it comes to learning objectives, we want to think about our assessments and evaluation very early on in the process of developing our learning objectives. We want to know what is that thing the student needs to accomplish and how am I as the instructor going to know that my student actually accomplished it and is competent or proficient with that skill. Now, there is an easy way to think about how to develop your learning objectives, and that's through something called Bloom's Taxonomy. Bloom's Taxonomy was developed in the mid-1900s for the first time. It's been revised a few times since. But generally speaking, the idea is that you divide up learning objectives by these different action words. So they start at the top with creation, evaluation, analysis, and towards the bottom you see things like rote memorization defined as remembering or knowledge, and then above that, understanding. Generally speaking, traditional education has led us to do things like remember and understand. The problem is students aren't very good at taking that information, that rote knowledge, and turning it into something productive by applying it in the real world. It's by having them create and evaluate and analyze and synthesize that we are able to ensure that they're doing these things right in the real world. So one thing you want to avoid doing when you're writing a learning objective is saying something like students will understand, because students typically are not very good at knowing what they know versus what they don't. And you'll notice that I use a particular structure there, that students will. That ultimately is that actionable, measurable thing that I as an instructor need to follow up with. So students will blank, and I would choose a verb from this list in Bloom's Taxonomy and then talk about the content. What about the content do they need to know? So for instance, if I'm teaching an English course, I might say students will be able to compare and contrast the themes from 1984 with contemporary worldly totalitarianism or something of that nature. If I'm teaching a science course, for instance at medical or dental school, I might say students will be able to take an X-ray and be able to evaluate or analyze the result of that X-ray to look for a tumor. So again, I'm taking something actionable, something my students can do, and something measurable, something that I as an instructor can look at and be sure I can evaluate. Now, as I was saying earlier on, transfer, the way that individuals take that information and then apply it in another context, or for instance, take it out of school and use it in the real world, it's pretty rare and it's hard to measure. Now, we know this because of a study and several studies that have been done since, but a study in particular by Gick and Holyoake in the early 1980s that looked at two different problems to be solved. So these problems were designed so that the solutions are almost the same thing. They really should be pretty simplistic for students to be able to understand and ideally transfer from one context to the next. So these college students were given the example of a castle to be sieged, and each side of the castle had a drawbridge. Now, if you were to take your entire army and then launch it across a particular drawbridge, it would split in half, break, and your army would drown in the moat. So that's not really a good solution. The optimal solution is that you would divide your army into 4 quarters, have them each siege the castle from one side, or enter the castle from one side, meet in the center, and take it over from there. Pretty straightforward. The second problem was given to them later, and it involved a tumor that needed to be treated in a patient's brain. Now, Brain tumors can be very difficult to operate on, and so the students were told you would need to use gamma radiation to treat the tumor. The trouble is, the gamma radiation beam at its highest setting is going to damage healthy tissue, and you don't want that to happen. So you needed to figure out what could we do with this radiation to make sure that it wasn't going to damage healthy tissue, but would in fact be strong enough to take out the tumor. And as you might assume, it's very similar to the first problem. You would divide and conquer. You send the beams through at different angles and have them converge at the point of the tumor to destroy it. That leaves the healthy tissue healthy, and it destroys the unhealthy tissue. The problem with this is that students were unable to take that information and transfer it themselves from one problem to the other, despite the content being very much the same. So when the students were not told what to do, only about 10% of them actually solved the second problem, having done the first problem. Once they were told to remember the castle problem, for instance, the instructor saying, hey guys, remember that problem we did yesterday? This should look a little bit familiar based on that. That number rose to only 30%. So only about a third of the students were able to solve that problem based on having done both of them and having been prompted by the instructor that they are the same thing. The third thing that was done in this study was taking that remembering concept, the prompt from the instructor, as well as a hint saying, well, not only did we do something like this yesterday, but there's also a divide and conquer thing going on here. That led to about 75% of students being able to solve the second problem. So you can see there's this transfer issue that keeps cropping up. And even when students are prompted, there's no good way to get them to see the almost direct overlap between the two things when it should be kind of apparent to them. So what that means for us as instructors is that we need to think about how we develop our courses and our instruction around those issues. Again, going back to this one-to-one with our learning objectives and activities, we want to start with our learning objectives at the center of everything we do. That is, all of these learning objectives we developed about the course content using Bloom's taxonomy. We then want to think about, okay, now that we know what our students' goals are, what we need them to know, we need to start thinking about how are we going to assess those things, how are we going to evaluate them and ensure that our students can do them, which is very important in virtually every class that you'd want them to take. Because why take the class if not to do something with it outside of class? Once you have that assessment measure planned, then you can start thinking about your instruction or your teaching. So that is, you don't want to start thinking about your instructional materials until you've already planned your assessments. And in this case, assessments could mean things like traditional tests or quizzes. But in many cases, if you're talking about actionable, measurable things, you want them to be projects or things that students have created on their own, things that are at the top of Bloom's taxonomy to really highlight their demonstration of knowledge. So to summarize, we want to think about learning objectives as the crux of everything we do as instructors. It shouldn't just be an afterthought. It shouldn't be something that we sort of push off to the side and assume students will understand. They really should be the core of everything we do. And then using that core, we want to develop our assessments and work backward through backward design to develop our instruction and start thinking about how can we teach more effectively, how can we teach not to the assessment per se, but to help our students understand what they need to do to be successful in the real world with those learning objectives.